I have a question or comment for Gurpreet. So you seem to suggest that in the Indian tradition, religion is taken as part of our being human. So, and it is valued as an individual belief and as a community feeling, as a community reality. But isn't it dangerous that you leave it up to the customary tradition? You are suggesting, for instance, it was a very interesting example, that there's no, you seem to suggest that the problem in Europe, that everything has to be formalized, everything has to become a claim, and then there has to be a response. And and I think what you're talking about is not just simply accommodation, it is respect. Respect for the other as an individual and respect for the other as a community. But wouldn't this be a fragile system in case somebody comes to power who disagrees with the beliefs or the ways of a given community? And the second comment or question is, I think, for all three other speakers, a bit reflecting on what Joe Weiler said, but I think the problem is with liberal intolerance. So that kind of intolerance that says some religions are compatible with a moderate, or whatever we want to call it, secularism, or with liberalism, but some religions are not compatible with that. Because I think what happens today in Europe, and maybe also in North America or other parts of the world, is that some forms of religion and of feelings of being religious expressed either individually or as a community are okay with the liberal democratic order, and some aren't. So it's not just about religion, and as you also said, and I think Tarek and Tarek also illustrated, there is a certain perception of some religions that plays a role.
Thank you. Rainer?
These are two comments also triggered by Joseph Weiler's exaggerations. The first one is the way you try to make a distinction between secular and religious worldviews. It came to my mind, there's a way how you could challenge this on the secular side. People like Dworkin in his last book, said there is such a thing as religion without God or religious atheism, and that is a belief in ultimate values that don't need a foundation in religion, properly speaking, that refers to God as an authority outside this world. If you think this is a coherent worldview, then it might be, on many ways, much closer to the religious worldview from the perspective of organizing a democratic, liberal, tolerant society. So it would confirm what you say, that secularism of that kind at least can be accepted as another worldview that is sufficiently similar to religion that it can fit in a common framework. If that is the case, however, and that's the second question, then what's the common framework that you would expect the state to build up that equally respects religious worldviews and these kinds of worldviews? For example, why would you expect that a secularist of that kind, who doesn't believe in God but believes in some kind of ultimate values, would be happy with religious establishment? I completely accept that religious minorities, might feel more safe and more secure under a framework where the state recognizes religion. But of course, those who don't believe in religion as a theistic worldview might say that, the state does something that doesn't represent my worldview to the same extent as it represents religious worldviews.
Okay, last question in the first round, and then we'll have other questions, and then I'll ask this panelist to respond.
Thank you. My question is to both Tarek, Ramazan, and Modut. As well as I understand, correct me if I am wrong, the inherent assumption in both presentations is that they were focusing on Europe and taking Muslims as a minority. But if you move from Europe to Middle East and Muslim majority world, where Islam is majority, would you still use the same conceptual and theoretical framework, or you totally change, at least revise it?
Professor Weiler.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
2.5 questions were addressed to you.
Okay. So, was there secularism that was neutral? It has less to do with the nature of secularism and more to do with the nature of the social condition in which it emerges. What I try to say is, when the worldview, the dominant worldview is that everybody is religious, the only difference is I'm a Catholic, you're a Protestant, etc., but there's secularism as such has very little purchase on society, then secularism could be seen as a neutral position, mediating between different religions, trying to compete for influence, power, etc. It's like thinking of black as the absence of color. So since the dominant, everybody is religious and the competition is among religions, so secularism in that respect is neutral. But there reaches a point when we understand that black is not the absence of color. We use black as a color, painted black. When the cleavage in society is primarily between religious worldviews and non-religious worldviews, and secularism is not simply the absence of religion, but a thoughtful, well-established, deep commitment to a worldview, not simply the absence of religion, then secularism is exactly that. It's a well-thought, deep, established way of looking at the world, which is not neutral. And what I try to show is that it has the same intolerant tendency as religion has, especially when it comes into power. You want an example of illiberal secularism? It's all around us. I gave already an example. In France, if there was a Christian majority and they said we would like to privilege Christianity, the constitution would say you cannot do that. You could impose a socialist worldview, a communist worldview, a neoliberal, God forbid, worldview, etc. But one worldview that you're not allowed to establish because we are constitutionally secular is a religious worldview. That's illiberal liberalism. That's illiberal secularism. In most hardly laïc states, like those two wonderful bedfellows, the United States and France, you can have secular parents could happily send their kids to a school because the school by definition will correspond to their worldview, which is secular, and the state will pay for the education of their children. But if they want their children to receive a religious education, they will have to pay out of their pocket or rely on the charity of the Catholic Church or the Muslim community or the Jewish community in order to give a religious education to their children. It privileges the worldview of secular parents against the worldview of non-secular parents. The examples are galore. I think we just have to be honest about that. It is a worldview, and I said, in my view, it is totally legitimate within liberal democracy that a worldview which is shared by a majority should be privileged. We try and define fundamental rights, etc. The notion that all the liberal state has to do is to protect freedom of religion is too easy. If somebody came and said, God revealed himself to me yesterday and told me to take my son, my only son, the son I love, to walk 3 days along the Via Vecchia Fiesole and to sacrifice him at the top of the hill, I would say, with all due respect to freedom of religion, if you take one step in that direction, I will put you in prison for child endangerment and attempted murder. And it wouldn't help to say so. And this leads me for a more difficult proposition. We should treat different religions differently, Anna. It's a knee-jerk liberal reaction that because we call it religious, it should all be treated in the same way. Why should we treat all religions in the same way? If there's a religion that says you sacrifice your oldest son to God, why should we treat it in the same way we treat a religion that doesn't say that, or that says, I don't think it's illegitimate, I think it's mistaken, but I don't think it's illegitimate for a society, as several European societies do today, to say our concern for, we are competing values, our concern for animal welfare is greater than our concern for religious freedom, and therefore we will not allow Muslims and Jews to slaughter the animals ritualistically, because we as a society think that animal welfare is more important than those people being able to eat meat if it means cruelly slaughtering animals, if indeed it is cruel. I think it's mistaken, but I don't think it's illegitimate to look at different religions and say, I am a liberal state, I have certain irreducible values, exactly in the way that And I will only tolerate freedom of religion to the extent that it doesn't violate my incommensurate values, like, for example, gender equality, etc. And to the extent that it does, I will not tolerate it. And if religions differ in the way they treat gender, I will treat religions differently. It's very difficult for, now to Rainer, which of course is, as usual, the most subtle, unexaggerated and searching questions, just teasing Rainer. You are right that in some respects secularism is, religious atheism when the paradigm is irreducible fundamental truth, etc. But that was not the distinction I made. The distinction I made that we religious people also use the vocabulary of holiness and sacredness in a way which is simply ontologically impossible for a secular worldview, because that's the definition of secularism. It's just almost a lexical matter that when you talk about the existence of a transcendent God, etc., you're in the realm of Now, maybe I'm falling into the trap of condescension, etc. Maybe it's very difficult to have an Archimedean point, etc. But I do think that in that respect there is a real fundamental difference between religion and atheist religion or religious atheism, which is similar in the sense of irreducible fundamental precepts, but is not in the vocabulary of holiness and sacredness. And it's also some of the problems, because for a religious person it's easy to understand, for example, that liberalism will have irreducible truths, because also religious people have irreducible, non-negotiable truths. So we are on the same Rawlsian playing field. But in a paradox on Rawls, it's difficult for the secular person to understand the sensibility of the religious person to the sacred and the holy, because it really is difficult to grasp what it means, and therefore there can be quite a lot of things that seem trivial in a secular society which are actually very meaningful in a religious worldview. Finally, not these exaggerated, if you have female circumcision or if you sacrifice your son, we will treat you differently. Even if we have equally liberal, tolerant, sort of corresponding to liberal values religions, I don't see that it's at all a problem that in a society which is predominantly Christian, the public holidays will be Christmas and not Hanukkah. That the day of rest on the week will be Sunday and not Friday or Saturday. In the same way, it would be unexceptional to me that in Egypt it will be Friday and in Israel it will be Saturday, the public day of rest. Now I will accommodate other religious minorities. So in Britain we have Sunday closing rules which allow Muslims to close on Friday and to open on Saturday, and Jews to close on Saturday and open on Sunday. But it doesn't disturb my liberal democratic sensibility that if a majority of the society and their cultural asset is Christian, that in many ways Christianity will be privileged as compared to other minority religions to whom we should show accommodation and understanding. But I don't find that at all illiberal that if I live in a Christian society, there will be many aspects of Christian culture which predominate. It's what we call democracy.
Okay, thank you. Gurpreet, there was a question from Anna for you.
I think there were 2 or 3 different kinds of questions, Anna, and let me say the following. I think for a long time, whenever the question of minorities came up, we were always whenever we were talking about minorities, we were always looking for what is the legal structure and the formal structure, what principles should be in place. And I think that had a value and has a value, because one did come across these issues of does the legal structure even allow you to think in terms of even-handedness, even if there is a privileging of one, etc., etc. But I want to say that something more may be needed, and maybe Tariq Ramadan had this thing that it's not just the legal structure, but structures, other spaces where alienation could be taking place. And I want to add to that and say it's not only that alienation could be taking place elsewhere, but look at a framework which is provided legally. How does it operate on the ground? The Indian constitution gives you the right to religious practice, not just worship, but also religious practice. But that really leaves the burden on everybody else to see whether actually people have the space to practice. And that is why you need to find ways in which we are not thinking of just getting a principle. You need the principle sometime, but that's never going to be enough. You need to find ways in which actually accommodation is made possible in diverse situations and circumstances, and the demand for a specific form of accommodation would also vary. And that's why I wanted to speak and focus on the informal. And really to highlight that I think as political theorists, particularly in normative political theorists, we are always in search of that one principle that will do the trick. And I think it's time really to move away from that way of thinking about accommodation. On the question of religion, I probably did not communicate well. I don't want to make only a deeply ideological statement that religion is important for our human existence, to discover our humanity fully. I'm pitching it much lower, and I hope it will be clearer in the paper, that I'm saying that that's why I'm bringing in understanding. It's not that I need to become the other. I don't need to endorse myself always a religious way of life, but I need at least to try and open myself to the possibility of where is the other person coming from. And it's a much more modest claim, and therefore recognizes the possibility of other people not holding similar beliefs. But I need to recognize that instead of prejudging, I need to open myself that there may be some thinking or rationality behind that other action, and I need really to get to that. About the third element, what if a person with a deep religious commitment came to power? And you have already explained exactly the Aquinas kind of dilemma, that if I truly believe in something, why would I let others suffer and be confined to hell? Why don't I rescue their soul? So that's always the danger. And that's why it's not a case of valuing religion per se. It's a case of recognizing religious diversity and valuing religious diversity. Okay? You can have many reasons for it, pragmatic and normative, from the fact that we want to exist together, to the fact that we have done so, and we can possibly do that. It's part of our historical way of living, to more positive statements that actually we have arrived at this present vantage point because of the contributions to knowledge of different civilizations and groups. So we need to affirm that kind of diversity, not religion per se.
Yes, I'll respond to Anna and the other question that was asked about how one might extend what we're saying to Muslim majority societies and states. So I take your very general question, and interpreting generally and how others have interpreted, to in a way be asking about what is the relationship between liberalism and secularism, and liberalism and or secularism, as it were, supporting some religions but not others, or some aspects of some religions and not other aspects, and so on. And does that in some ways compromise a commitment to neutrality, which might be a commitment of liberalism and secularism? Well, I don't think that neutrality actually is a very helpful concept, the way that it's often discussed. I don't think it is a feature either of liberalism or of secularism. So my very kind of minimal idea of secularism, political secularism, that's to say minimal in the sense of where we begin, not where we end, but where we begin, is that secularism is the commitment to those political arrangements where political authority does not rest on religious authority. And to some extent, the other way around as well, where you have then mutual autonomy, or what Alfred Stepan has called twin tolerations, that the sphere of political authority and the sphere of religious authority largely exercise their authority in their own domain. I think that there has to be a mutual autonomy rather than absolute separation, because that would be impossible, because sometimes they can work together, sometimes they seek to work together, and there's nothing about the nature of their authority that should rule that out, where, as it were, a cooperative arrangement is sought. What is being ruled out is a kind of what one might call imposition of one form of authority over the other. So, but that's not by itself liberal or indeed even very democratic, you know, that very minimal notion of secularism that I've just expressed. But we are, of course, talking about liberal democratic states. I think that's what most of us are interested in talking about. So I would then say that the kind of secularism that we should be talking about is secularism that goes beyond the mutual autonomy, but works within, broadly speaking, what we might call liberal, democratic, constitutional structures. And it's those structures, you know, liberal, democratic, and constitutional, that become the check upon what is and is not acceptable. So, for instance, child sacrifice. The objection to child sacrifice doesn't come from secularism, it comes from the rights of individuals that any liberal state would be bound to uphold. So it's not being a secularist to say, I'm choosing between a child sacrificing religion and a not child sacrificing religion, and therefore betraying neutrality. The liberal democratic state is not a neutral state. As I say, I don't find the term neutral at all helpful. It asserts its values, the liberal democratic constitutional values, but of course these are open to so many different kinds of interpretations. And as Joe Valer said, you know, Britain and France and America and so on interpret liberal democratic constitutionalism very differently, though with, of course, some common ground as well. The question then, whether we accommodate organized religion or we don't accommodate organized religion, is an additional question. It doesn't flow from liberal democratic constitutionalism, and it doesn't flow from my minimal idea of secularism. So we then have to make a further, as it were, commitment, you know, political choice about whether we think it's good to accommodate religion or not. And Joe's said quite a lot about, you know, how France has made one kind of decision, other countries make other kinds of decisions. I'm certainly committed, as I think anyone looking at my paper and implicit in what I said, that accommodating religion is better than trying to exclude it from the public space, trying to, in some sense, diminish its authority over its adherents. And then on top of that comes the question of, well, which religion or which religions? And I'm very committed to accommodating diversity, or as I prefer to express it, because it involves certain normative concepts, multiculturalism. So all these things are, as it were, different layers of arguments, all of which have to be justified in relation, you know, in their own terms. They don't all come from secularism, they don't all come from liberalism. So I don't see secularism or liberalism as the master concept, or to use Tariq's term, the ideology from which the rest follows. How does this apply to Muslim majority states? Well, given that the secularism that I'm talking about and that I've characterized as moderate secularism is very much derived from a contingent history, a Western European history, in which liberal democratic constitutional states have developed, and in which both secularism and the accommodation of religion both conform to liberal democratic constitutional frameworks, insofar as I'm able to apply it to frameworks outside that, I'd want to see a fair degree of liberal democratic constitutional states. So in that sense, it wouldn't matter whether they were Christian or Buddhist or Muslim and so on. There are a number of Muslim states that have some degree of liberal democratic constitutionalism, and there's a lot of Muslim states that don't have much of that. So the application would depend upon, that important difference. But the problem wouldn't be about secularism per se, or even liberalism per se, or neutrality per se.
Shall I bring you in later? Or do you want to say something? Very quickly. Because I did advise the audience that the shorter the question, the more answers they'll get in. And as it is, the answers start turning out to be much, much longer than the question. So very quick,
The shorter the question, the longer the answers.
Very quick remark, and then let's have a second round of questions.
Okay, yes. I wanted to react on things, because I think that the discussion that we had about the way we have to perceive or to understand secularism and secularity as also something that has to do with a worldview and a potential way of dealing with religion itself. I think it's critical. You have in some, but not only in France, by the way, I think in many countries, sometimes when we deal with a so-called neutral secularism, the mindset and the way it's promoted is with a religious mindset. It's a religious mindset. It's really with dogma, with, so in France, for example, I was talking to somebody saying, you know what, schools are our temple. You enter into the school and you have to be neutral. And you have this discussion. So I think that this discussion, it's also important because, as it was said, we can't have anything which has to do with accommodation. And this is where there was a tension in what I heard. It's talking about accommodation means, at the first place, for the people to take religions seriously. So there are accommodations because there is a positive take on the religious belongings. I think that is critical. The people are not going to accommodate if they think that religion is a problem. So if you don't have a positive take on religion and religious practices, talk about accommodation is not going to be working in the public sphere if the concept of religion is problematic. Add to this what you said, that the perception is, and this is why I agree with you, we should acknowledge the fact that we are not going to treat all the religions the same. It depends on, but the perception that we have today, for example, from an Islamic perspective, is intrinsically it's impossible for Muslims to abide by the liberal democratic system because there is something which is intrinsically. So using differentiation in the way we deal with Islam into acknowledging or implementing natural discrimination, and that you Muslims, you have to change your religion in order, so it's the whole concept of reforming Islam or moderate Muslims, which is coming out of this. And my last point about majority, and I think it's a critical question. I myself stopped talking about Muslim minority, even dealing with scholars saying when they came with what was called the fiqh al-aqaliyat, the legal system of minorities. I'm sorry, that's people who are thinking that way are thinking from outside the Western reality. I am not a minority as a citizen, and I don't want to be dealing in such a way. And in Muslim majority countries, I would say, I don't use the concept of minority, by the way, when it comes to citizenship and being Muslims in the secular system or in our liberal democratic system. But the point is that even though we don't deal with it, and I would say, and this is where I agree, and something which is essential, even though I don't speak about minority, you cannot deny the fact that when you are in a society, you have to deal with something which is a majority culture, that you have to respect this as something which is part of you have to do this while at the same time questioning the narrative by saying, if this majority culture at the end it's exclusive, it's problematic. And this is the discussion I had in Malaysia, with Muslims who are now using the narrative to put Christians and Chinese outside the common narrative. So they are doing exactly the same as what we see now in Europe. And I think that this is a problem, and this is where minority and majority could be problematic, depends how we are using them.